Alright, first of all, good afternoon everyone. This paper is more of sort of an ethnographic account of how I did my research, the learnings, unlearnings and relearnings about the whole research process, and then it finally culminates to my finding, which are broadly related to the topic of gender and gendered public space at the Corniche. So it will be a bit of a back and forth, so I will start with an introduction, then I will tell my experience before and after the Corniche, which will also have the detailed theoretical account, and finally I will end with one of the sort of ethnographic anecdotes which will sort of sum up the whole experience together. Yeah. Alright, so I titled it Gendering the Corniche. Anthropologists have long engaged with the sea, and there's a vast body of literature coming from Malinowski to the likes of Margaret Mead. Sea has appeared in anthropological literature from various angles, be it physical, political, social, economic, and more recently even cultural. It is for this reason that ethnographic journal Ethnofood dedicated their 2015 issue to the sea, and they titled it The Sea as an Eminently Human Affair, and wrote in the editorial introduction, time seems ripe for anthropologists and other students of culture, both social, scientific and humanities, to head for the sea and to seriously start study with the sea of what people do near, on, in, under, with and to the oceans. How do they do it, with whom, and what kind of results it produces. In this paper I engage with the aspects of what people do near the sea and what kind of cultural knowledge is produced about the sea by the people and through the sea about the people. Yeah, I specifically focus on the sporting and leisure activities that veiled Muslim women engage in at the Corniche, to see if and how they self-construct notions of gender and gendered public space at the Corniche. I'm not very well versed with feminist anthropology, and therefore this paper is my observations, which I hope will inspire others to apply their understanding and further contribute to the cultural production about and from the sea. Standing on the terrace garden with a few friends on the lower campus at the American University of Beirut, we were discussing if Beirut is really the Paris of the Arab world. And if yes, does Corniche contribute to the Paris-ness of Beirut? One of them said, maybe not, as Corniche, despite its diversity and openness, contradicts many values and ethos that are quite central to the French culture. I nodded in disagreement at such massive generalizations, and he winked at me saying I was referring to the veiled Muslim women. He added, Corniche is good, just that the poverty and the veils seem out of sight but not out of mind. And for me personally, under the third wave form of feminism, his statement does not incorporate intersectionality, but it is a bare example of sexism, Islamophobia and Eurocentrism, all of which have important implications when you study them from an anthropological perspective. The Corniche, which is roughly 4.8 kilometer long stretch, connects the sea to the central district of Beirut, although my research is specifically limited to the stretch around AUB campus. Anthropology as an academic discipline primarily tries to answer two fundamental questions. What does one need to know about the social world? And secondly, how do you do it? How do you know about the social world, right? How does one do this? I was at the Corniche to talk to veiled Muslim women about their partaking in sporting activities at the Corniche, to know if and how they construct the concept of gender and link it to public space through those sporting activities. It is much later in my research I realize veiled Muslim women might not be constructing any notions of gender simply because of them being veiled. This realization is both paradoxical and more complicated, as the relationship between human and non-human element, in this case the veil, helped me reach this understanding. I was trying to research veiled Muslim women's self-construction of notions of gender and gendered public space, which actually is the interaction between the non-human element, that is the veil, and the human social element, which is created near the sea. So now I'll tell you before and after the theoretical framework at the Corniche. But where did I start my research? Did I just walk up to them? What if they felt intruded by my presence into their space. What do I say? Hi, I wish to speak to you. Like, it was a bit overwhelming for me, given the fact that I'm not an Arab and I'm trying to do ethnographic writing on gender issues in the Arab world. Although there was chaos, but everything seemed quite organized and simple. However, as I entered the field, I not only felt the complexity of locating the starting point, but moreover, I did not know how to articulate what I saw in front of me in sociological, anthropological terms. I could see many activities happening at the same time. People walking, rushing traffic, food and drink vendors on the corniche, people talking, listening to music, everything which otherwise is quite mundane. It is in this regard that perhaps I appreciated Latour when he says, why is it so tough to trace the social? And he writes, although it seems at first sight that the subject matter of social sciences was easy to locate, thanks to the massive evidence of social order, it now appears that it's just the opposite. There is nothing more difficult to grasp than social ties. It's traceable only when it's modified. Therefore, building on Latour's this understanding of social and what he refers to as sociology of associations, where the heterogeneous human and the heterogeneous non-human elements interact and build associations which are not firm but loose and contradictory. Hence, in my research, it should have been the diversity of politics of the veiled Muslim women and their interaction with that social world at Corniche through sporting activities, which I should have then further problematized and researched the connections and tensions between them. However, and perhaps unfortunately, based on the existing hegemonic literature that is predominantly coming from the West on veiled Muslim women in the Arab world, I assumed a firm, uniform politics of the veiled Muslim women. That is, she will most likely do this, think that, act in a particular way, or respond to my questions in a particular way, all because she's veiled. And I saw her only through that veil. I was giving her all the agency only through the veil. And I think it is adequate to say that in Latourian terms, my approach was that of the what he calls, sociology of the social. That's perhaps what I was doing. Therefore, I was imagining that the only source of agency for the veiled Muslim women in the public space is coming through the non-human element, that is the veil. Although I was giving agency to the non-human in the Latourian sense, but in order to come out of this cycle, I needed to create space for more sources of agency. And Latour's rationale to flatten the field site emerges from this fact that he questions that where are the vehicles that transport individuality, subjectivity, and personhood. Therefore, me asking what notions of gender and gendered public space veiled Muslim women construct through the process of playing sports assumes that there is a certain construction happening in the first place, and that construction is primarily happening because of them being veiled. In this case, rather than questioning the hegemonic categories of gender and gendered public space, I expected an answer which potentially might be different from what I've read in the existing literature, but broadly I wanted it to fit into these categories of both gender and gendered public space, right? What if there was no such categories for veiled Muslim women? Not because they are veiled, but because veil might not be the deciding factor into them answering this question on how they construct gender and gendered public space at the Corniche. In the end, before I write my field experience, which would testify my mistakes and learnings, my main theoretical learning experience is that it was not just me asking wrong questions, but also expecting superficial answers. Latour, in his expectations about research in the social world, finally writes, the task of defining and ordering the social should be left to the actor themselves and not taken by the analyst. This is why, to regain some sense of order, the best solution is to trace connections between the controversies themselves rather than I am trying to decide and settle the controversy. This has proven absolutely true in my case because the above mentioned realizations have not come through just reading Latour and other literature, but by talking to veiled women themselves. This made me realize through our conversations over cycling and skating. Finally, through my conversations, I also challenged the putative hierarchy between me as the student academic and the women as my research subjects, and the hierarchies of colonial logic that define relationships between the expert ethnographer and the exotic specimen. Above all, the conversations which we had in public space shall challenge the stereotype that veiled Muslim women do not engage with conversations with strange men and that men cannot do research on gender issues in so-called conservative, in quotes, communities. And finally, the ethnographic brief account, which will perhaps put everything together. So over the duration of the course, I visited Cornish outside AUB countless times, and every time I learned something about myself by unlearning something which I assumed I knew about the other. So the only way I learned was unlearning what I assumed I knew about the other. It started off me by just hanging out there and often staring straight into people's eyes and sometimes nodding my head sideways, the typical Indian way, to both acknowledge, no, but you know that doing that thing sideways is both to acknowledge that I'm a foreigner and also that it's a symbolic body gesture which would perhaps be the starting point for some conversations. I was also quite naive and perhaps unethical in my creative ways to talk to people, especially veiled Muslim women. One example I clearly remember is me asking a veiled AUB student about where I'm standing, pretending as if I'm lost, despite me very well being aware where I'm standing. She helped me, but I did not have a productive conversation. At other times, I would simply stop them and say, I'm doing research and I really need to talk to them and have their opinion. Majority of the times, it was a clear no, followed by a humble apology. And other times, they often spoke way too little and quite unproductive. Finally, out of my utter disappointment and losing interest in research, I decided to have some fun. Hence, cycling and skating comes in. Little I knew this is actually the starting point of my research, not only for this subject, but also for my understanding of how I should do ethnographic research in future, since this is just my first semester, right? So I stopped a couple of people to inquire, how about where do I go to register for cycling and skating, and how do I wish to join this so-called group? Not only were they helpful, including women whom I stopped, but this led as a starting point for me to have conversations with them. This is where I meet Azra. I've changed her name. She's 31 and wears full veil, chador, and was at the Cornish to teach her 5-year-old daughter how to skate. The week I met her for the first time, she gave me the contact of the person in charge, and I was good to be part of the group next week, although we did not exchange contact numbers, but we spoke for good 35 minutes, after which we were joined by her husband, who had returned from jogging all around the Cornish. I met her again for 2 consecutive weeks. The first week I reached a bit early on the Cornish and saw her with her family. We shared a formal greeting from a distance, like, salam, that sort of a thing, at which ended sort of, I'll see you soon. At around 6 p.m., the entire group met again to skate and cycle. Although I'm using the word group here, but it was quite informal, and everyone grouped and regrouped every week without actually sharing numbers. The only people who perhaps were organized were the business guys who were renting the skates and cycles, right? And perhaps few people had their numbers. So there was a small group formed based on their skating skills, or if people were friends and they would just like to skate together. So I regrouped with Azra and her daughter, and we started skating, during which I told her about I'm a master's candidate at American University of Beirut, and I'm doing research on gender issues and about veiled women, and put forward some of my own bias. I asked her about her views, to which she readily agreed, and we had a long discussion which finally feeds into my research. She told me that veil does not stop her from doing what she wants, but at the same time it does not help her specifically into doing something that she wants to do. She saw the materiality of the veil as simply spiritual. In other words, she was blurring the lines between the physical and the metaphysical. And I clearly remember an example which she gave of the horizon. She was like, do you see the horizon? The sea, which is a physical entity, meets the sky, which is a metaphysical entity. Although they would never meet, but for you they clearly meet, which is the horizon. And to her, this view, I asked and to her it was this view which makes Cornish beautiful and worth coming. And since it is also a public space where people do sports, when I asked her if she would go to do sports elsewhere, she replied yes, if it had a similar atmosphere where I could get to learn and meet more people, and meet them to extents which are convenient for me and my family. Hence, to her, it was not about the public space or private space or the specific speciality of the Cornish, but a combination of factors which Latour basically calls associations. Her understanding of Cornish was also the interaction which both the human and non-human elements, which she read through her own complex spirituality, right? Hence, even spirituality, which is both human and non-human, made me realize that gender at the Corniche is not what I should have been looking for.